Manager for the Miller Introduction to Judaism program here at AJU. You are tuned into Let My People Know, remembering Luminary Adin Evan Israel Steinsaltz on the Biachad Together Spirited by AJU platform. American Jewish University advances and elevates the Jewish journey of individuals, organizations, and our community through excellence in scholarship, teaching, engaged conversation, and outreach. This Biachad platform was developed to deliver online learning that captures the insights of our faculty and friends and convenes our diverse and inclusive community to advance ideas, dialogue, and debate. I am honored to introduce AJU's own Rabbi Dr. Bradley Shavit Artson. He holds the Abner and Rosalind Goldstein Dean's Chair of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies and is Vice President of American Jewish University. He is a member of the philosophy department, and he is particularly interested in theology, ethics, and the integration of science and religion. Rabbi Artson is also the Dean of the Zacharias Frankel College in Potsdam, Germany, ordaining conservative rabbis for Europe. Today, Rabbi Artson will be in conversation with Rabbi Pinchas Alush, Rabbi Steinsaltz's Talmid Muvchak, the closest of all his students. Rabbi Alush is the founding rabbi of one of the most vibrant and fastest growing synagogues in the United States, Congregation Beth Tfilah of Scottsdale, Arizona, where he resides with his wife, Esther, and 9 children. He's deeply involved in the Jewish community of Greater Phoenix, where he teaches middle school Judaics at Pardes Jewish Day School and is a member of the Orthodox Rabbinic Council of Arizona. Rabbi Alush is a prolific blogger for the Huffington Post, Times of Israel, and many other large publications. He is fluent in English, Hebrew, French, and Italian. As a recognized rabbinic figure and a respected author of numerous literary works, he has enlightened and inspired audiences throughout the United States, Europe, Israel, and South Africa. You can understand why Rabbi Alush was named one of America's 36 most inspiring rabbis who are shaping 21st century Judaism by the Daily Jewish Forward. Without further ado, Rabbi Artson and Rabbi Alush.
Thank you very much, Deb. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be able to be with you today and to be able to share a conversation with my colleague, Rabbi Alush, to talk about his revered teacher, and in a sense, a revered teacher for so many of us, even the many of us who have not met him. You know, during a person's lifetime, their greatness is primarily manifest through the people whose lives they come into physical contact with. But then as they transition into the ages, they really become the property of all humanity. And what they leave behind them trickles beyond the reach of their immediate circle. So in a sense, we have 2 generations. We have the one who grew up with him and knew him as a human being and as a teacher, and we're interested in hearing all about that. And then reflections through his writings and his larger ripples out in the world. So let's start by welcoming Rabbi Alush. And perhaps, Rabbi, if you could start by sharing with us your relationship with Rabbi Steinsaltz, how you got to know him, and maybe some salient stories that you want to share.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Rabbi Artson. Thank you, Deb, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to American Jewish University. It's really a pleasure and an honor being here with all of you. So speaking of my personal relationship with Rabbi Steinsaltz, it really began at the age of 7.5. You know, as young kids, we like to count our years by month. So 7 and 6 months, 7 years and 6 months. My father took me to a lecture of his. We were living then in Toulouse, France, where I was born also. And we had heard that Rabbi Steinsaltz, the Talmudist, was coming to town. He took me to his lecture. I didn't quite understand anything that he spoke about. But after the lecture, I had a question for Rabbi Steinsaltz. So I ran to the door to catch him and I asked him my question. And Rabbi Steinsaltz, I remember, looked at me as if I was the only person in the room. Related to me, I was a young child. Related to me as if I was the greatest genius that he was speaking to, and I was not. And he answered my question with love, with understanding, and with clarity. And I knew then that I was speaking to a giant of history. And you know, I like to quote the Song of Songs that says, "Nafshi yatzah b'dabero ito," that my soul came out, my soul clicked with his right then. But then my family then moved to South Africa. We really didn't have the chance to see him again until we then made Aliyah when I was 13 from South Africa. I was enrolled then in his middle school. Thereafter, I went to his Mekor Chaim High School in Jerusalem, where I continued to study with him. He would come quite often at that time to the yeshiva, to the high school. And I decided to make him then my mentor at a very young age, again, 13, 14 years old. And I wouldn't just go and study with him what he would teach at yeshiva, but I would go and seek his advice for almost every life decision I was making then, and I continued to make throughout the years. So as a mentor, he really guided me through all of my life's crossroads and twists and decisions. And really, I could confidently say that it is thanks to him that I became a rabbi. It's thanks to him that I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona, in Scottsdale, and it's thanks to him that I do what I do. He is my spiritual father par excellence. A short anecdote, since you asked, Rabbi, but I remember that, you know, growing up again in Israel from the age of 13, all my peers were going to the army. And I wanted also to go to the Israeli army. That was my goal. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do when I grew up, but said to myself, maybe I'll become an attorney. And at the age of 18, I went and I passed all these tests to go and be enrolled in this elite unit in the Israeli army. And then I had to share with them that I have a genetic disease, thank God, not a dangerous one, but it's a disease, it's a Sephardic disease actually, called FMF, familial Mediterranean fever. And the army told me, we're sorry, we can't accept you. So my life crumbled. And I went to see Rabbi Steinsaltz. And of course, he cried with me and he encouraged me to be strong, chazak ve'ematz, as they say. And then he said to me, why don't you go to Geneva? I hear there's an option there to be a youth director in the Jewish community. Now, this was an idea that the greatest minds could have never thought of. But he was my mentor. And I went to Geneva, became involved in the Jewish community. And then I understood his genius because that work resonated with me deeply. And that's how eventually I decided to become a rabbi and not an attorney. But it was those pieces of advice that really molded my life up until this point.
So we're going to have a lot of time to talk about the legacy of his remarkable production, a one-man cottage industry. I don't think anyone has written so much Judaic work of quality since Rashi. But before we get to the content of his work, I want to start with the content of his neshama. You know, often you read the writings of great thinkers and then you meet the individual and they're not the same person. But in reading his works, you get this sense of a very, really well-named, sweet and gentle soul. And in talking to you and other people who have known him, that seems to be reinforced. So what part of his greatness flowed not simply from his intellect, but from his character? And talk to us about what kind of a person he was.
Right, that's a great question, because in a way it reminds me of that Indian parable with the blind man encountering an elephant. You know, and they were blind, so one held the trunk and he thought it was a tree, one had a tail and they thought it was a rope. So Rabbi Steinsaltz is that elephant of man, of course in the most glorious ways, in the most spiritual ways. So it's hard to really grasp the soul of this giant and to speak about the light that radiated from him. But if I had to encapsulate some of his light, some of that, you know, soul's radiance into certain characteristics, I would say that number one, he was a man of tremendous humility, of utter selflessness. It was never, ever, ever about him. In fact, he wrote about this. He told me this, that he really doesn't care what people write on his tombstone when he dies. He doesn't even care whether he'll go to heaven or to hell. All he wants to do is, in his words, infect people to move forward, to take one step forward in their own spiritual journey. That's all he wants to do. It was about infecting people. And He also told me that when he was 22 years old, just to speak about his humility, when 22 or 23 years old, he was given the task to teach the president of Israel at the time, Shazar, and some of his peers. There were university professors in that room. And he shared with me that when he came into that room at first, he felt like, who am I to teach these great people? I'm a pisher, in his words. And then he came to the realization, one second, they didn't come to listen to me, the 23-year-old. They came to listen to the voice of Torah that is being channeled through me. The voice of Torah is 3,000 years old. So I rewired my brain to think that actually I was the old one in the room. I was 3,023 years old.
That's right.
And they were the pishers. And it made me feel a little more comfortable. But in a way, I think it represented that tremendous humility. He wanted to be but that channel for God and for God's work in this world. And I asked him, just, I have so many stories about his humility, but maybe just one more. I asked him, Rabbi, can you tell me, why do you do what you do? And he replied, because there's no one else doing it, so I have to do it. Yes. It wasn't, again, it was about the work. It was about his purpose. It was never about him and his ego. That's number one. Number two, I also think that he had this unconditional love for every human being. I think that's why I felt what I felt at the age of 7.5 years old, as I mentioned before, that he just loved you for who you were, not for who you could become, not for the type of person you were, not for the title you had before your name. He loved you for who you were. He loved your soul unconditionally. And he expressed that love in the most sensitive way. Another anecdote, but whenever he came to America, I would try and see him and spend time with him. So being with him really to almost every city here in the country, but to Memphis, Tennessee, to New York, of course, Chicago, Miami, San Francisco, and many other places. But I remember being in New York with him and walking with him in Times Square. It's a story I wrote about. And if you've been to Times Square, as I'm sure many of you have been, so you know that people harass you and give you flyers from every direction. And Rabbi Steinsaltz is there walking, and I'm having a conversation with him, and he's grabbing every flyer and every brochure that's being handed to him. Now, I don't have to tell you, but many of those flyers are very inappropriate. Rabbi Steinsaltz, the great rabbi, is taking all these flyers. So at one point, I couldn't resist myself, and I asked him, Rabbi, why are you taking all these flyers? You obviously don't need them. And he replied, you're right, I don't need them. But these people need me to take those flyers from them. Why? He said, because they probably receive thousands of flyers to give out throughout the day. And after they give out those flyers, they get their pay. So if I take those flyers, I'm helping them get their pay a little quicker. So why not help a stranger with a little favor, get his pay a little quicker? Maybe they're dependent on that pay to provide food for their family. This was his love, his tremendous sensitivity, his openness to the needs of people, regardless of who they were. They could be strangers at Times Square handing you an appropriate flyer, or they could be a young 7.5-year-old child. But that certainly was a big characteristic of his. And I think the third characteristic, of course, there are many more, but maybe just to end with this one, I think it was his amazing wisdom. Many have written about it. Time magazine called him a once-in-a-million scholar, and the Newsweek called him a genius of the highest order. But I'm not just speaking about his wealth of wisdom. I'm speaking about his ability to see things that are unseen, to see the big picture, as they call it in German, the Weltanschauung, the great vision. And I think that's what he did with his work. He wasn't writing. I asked him once, Rabbi, why don't you write about politics? I never saw you write anything about politics. I mean, they're burning issues you should be writing about. And Rabbi Steinsaltz responded, and I think that points to that great wisdom and vision that he had. He said, I'm not the type of farmer that plants trees that grow very quickly and then collapse very quickly. I don't plant cucumbers. I'm there to plant avocado trees that will last for generations to come. Those are the words he mentioned. And that's why I don't write about politics. I'm not here just to give you something for now, to be gratified instantly. I'm here really to plant for generations to come. That's my vision. That's how far it goes. And he had that ability to really see things. I mean, in my personal life, I experienced that so many times. The example I gave about you should go to Geneva. Who would have thought of that? But he saw the big picture.
What aspect of Rav Steinsaltz, the man, was surprising? In other words, we all have a kind of rabbi in our brain, what we think rabbis are and ought to be. And it's easy to just see that aspect of our public figures or project that on them, and then the individual disappears. So share with us the part of Rabbi Steinsaltz that was just uniquely him.
Right. It's a great question. I would say that he never wasted an opportunity to make an impact. Whether he was, again, with a young child or not. This was a man who you could think was working so hard. He barely slept at night. I know, because I would very often call him in his office at 3 a.m. his time. And he was there working. And I knew that that was the best time to call him, because that was when he was calm. And so this was a man who you could expect, retreated from time to time and could take care a little bit of himself. But no, he was so devoted that he wanted to make an impact whenever he could. And I would say that that also expressed itself in the humor that he had. He was a man with tremendous sense of humor, but even his humor was calculated. He knew how to say it, when to say it, with whom to say it, because again, his obsession, so to speak, was to make that impact. And I haven't found that in any other human being that I've encountered with. A man that 24/7 is entirely devoted to making an impact in so many myriads of ways, with so many different tools, through humor, through his wisdom, or through just a simple conversation. I think that was very unique about him. Just another anecdote, thousands of them, but we lived in Atlanta before coming to Phoenix for 4 years. And I remember that he came to visit us, and I brought him to a local preschool to meet the children and the teachers. And there he was walking in the classrooms, and it was snack time for the children. And one of the children, I remember, was eating a banana. And so he goes to that child, he takes the peel of the banana and draws with his pen a nice smiley on the banana. And then he hands it back to the child and he says, "Do you like my smiley?" He says, "Yes, that's nice, Rabbi." So Rabbi Steinsaltz says, "You see, that's the lesson I want to leave you with, that even from garbage, you can make a smile, even from something." And I think that represents, in a way, very much his life. There was no garbage in his life. There was no wasted moment. And, yeah.
Tell me, in all the years, anything outstanding about the way he prayed? Something unique that he brought to prayer?
Right. So that's a great question, because I'm almost have tears remembering this. But one of my greatest pleasures, and I'll confess, I don't know if he liked me doing this or not. He probably did not. But one of my greatest pleasures was to see him, to watch him, not to interact with him in any shape or form, but to watch him pray each and every Shabbat in his synagogue, the Tzemach Tzedek Shul in the Old City. He would pray there with tremendous focus, meditation, even ecstasy and passion, from about 10 a.m. until about 5 p.m. every Shabbat. That's how long his morning prayer took. No, I'm not, it was just the morning, the Shacharit and the Musaf. And the way he focused on every word, the way he would turn prayers that spoke about the nation of Israel as his own supplication. God, it's enough. One of the prayers I remember him saying time and time again, and that's one of the things he would do, repeat verses almost to emphasize them. And there's that verse, Ki lo yitosh Hashem amo v'nachalato lo ya'azov. I remember him vividly repeating the verse time and time and time again, which means God did not forsake your nation. You promised, nachalato lo ya'azov, that you will not leave your portions of people in this world. And he repeated that time and time again, almost seeing himself, I believe, as the advocate for the Jewish people. So I think he brought not just meaning, but a tremendous passion to prayer. And watching him was a sight that would no doubt leave an indelible impact on all of those spectators that he probably did not want.
Thank you. So let me ask a transition question then. We've spoken about him as an individual, him as a man, I understand now why God couldn't bring peace to the Middle East, because he wouldn't interrupt Rabbi Steinsaltz at prayer, and so he was busy all day long. But one of the things that strikes me, and I never had the pleasure of meeting him as a person. Again, I grew up very differently than you. I came to Judaism as an adult. And one of the guides who walked me into Judaism was some of Rav Steinsaltz's English language books. We're going to talk a bit about his 13-petaled rose and his wonderful introduction to Kabbalah, and then his various guides to the Talmud. And one of the things that I discerned from a distance, and I'd love your thoughts about this, is that at the same time that he was able to hold a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of knowledge, he was at the core a simple Jew. His faith was a simple faith. And it also comes through in his English language books that his relationship with God is personal, and it's no different than his relationship to other core loves of his life, and his love of Masorah, even though, or maybe because he was so immersed in it, he really had a simplicity to his faith and his observance that in some ways preserved him. Talk about that.
So that's a great point, really a brilliant point. I think that, there are two types of simplicity. There's simplicity that comes from naivete, and that wasn't Rabbi Steinsaltz. There's simplicity that comes specifically through knowledge, that you've exhausted all intellectual options and you've realized my brain is finite. There are things that are beyond my knowledge. And then you almost, as they say in the 12-step program, then you have to give yourself over to the higher power. And then you realize, okay, I'm going to give over myself to that level of simplicity. And I think that's the simplicity that defined Rabbi Steinsaltz. He was a man, who grew up in a secular family. His parents were not just secular, but in a way anti-religious. And they told him,
some of the best rabbis do.
Right, that's right, like you, my friend. And so Rabbi Steinsaltz was told by his parents, you should learn the Talmud so that you know what you're fighting against. And he basically said, and he said this to me on multiple occasions, that he became so skeptic that he became skeptic of skepticism.
Right.
And then he realized there must be a higher power. And in a way, I think that is very much conveyed in his books, his conversations with people, his lectures across the world. It wasn't a simplicity that came again from naivete, but quite the opposite.
Yes.
I've studied all these books of science, and indeed he was a walking encyclopedia. He was at the crossroads of so many cultures and so many ideologies, and he spoke to all of them simultaneously, so he knew. But through that knowledge, he reached God.
Rabbi Alush, you and I have spoken about Rambam before. One of the brilliant insights, one of the many brilliant insights of Rambam, another great Jew I didn't yet know personally, although I'm hoping to at some point, is that he points out the limits of reason. But you can't know the limits of reason if you don't take it to its limit. So you have to pursue reason as far as it can go, but then at some point you make a leap. And Rabbi Steinsaltz is that person who took limit as far as it could go, broadly educated, immersed in science and general culture, and then says, okay, this is how far human brains can take us, and now we need an intuitive relationship, a jump. Mm-hmm. So let's transition to his writings. One of our attendees has asked, what book do you think I should begin if I wanted to start reading a book by Rabbi Steinsaltz? And I want to preempt your answer to that by going to the 13-petaled rose for a moment, because I certainly think that's the first English language book of his that anyone should read. And in it, he talks about he doesn't want to write a book describing Kabbalah, describing Jewish mysticism. He wants to write a book of mysticism. So the book allows you to experience it. But what's brilliant, I think, and I'd love your take on it, is that he writes it in a language that's accessible to anybody. You don't have to be a Makubal, a Kabbalist, to understand the book, although if you are, you can see all the hundreds of invisible footnotes on every line.
Right, right. Yeah. So an anecdote, and then I'll relate to the story, to the question itself, and to the 13 petal rose in specifics. But I remember being with him in New Jersey, in Teaneck, New Jersey, and he gave a lecture there in a synagogue, and there was a rabbi who spoke before him, and then it was his turn to speak. And they were both speaking about Yehoshua, the judge, and the Bible. And the rabbi spoke very eloquently. And then Rabbi Steinsaltz came, and he spoke in the Steinsaltz way, which maybe wasn't the most eloquent. It was profound, wise, but not always the most eloquent. And then I'm driving him back to New York to his hotel. And in the car, he tells me, you know, Penny, I think the rabbi before me spoke way better than I did. But we were trying to achieve two separate goals. He sought to speak about Joshua. I wanted to do a seance with Joshua, have him come through me and be presented to the Jewish people.
That's right.
And that was, I think, his goal in every book. And like you said, he made it so accessible, made Kabbalah so accessible, and so many other topics so accessible, because his goal was never to speak about the topic. He wanted to bring you into the room. We wanted you to meet Yehoshua, Rav Ashi, Rachel, Queen Esther. He wanted you to meet them. And then ask the questions that you may have. Not suffocate you with knowledge, but quite the opposite. Open up your own brains, your own mind, so to speak, so that you can come up with knowledge from within. And I think that's what he did with the 13 Petal Rose. His work on Kabbalah, and that book specifically, I know has had a tremendous impact on so many people. I speaking to a pastor in Phoenix here a few years ago, and he told me that he had read the book multiple times and that it changed his life. Now, you ask yourself why. I think that's, again, because Rabbi Steinsaltz is that type of, to use maybe a different analogy, of tour guide. You know, we go to Israel, we have tour guides. We go to different places, we have tour guides. So you two types of tour guides. There's a tour guide that comes and tells you everything about the place, and he shows you this is this, and this is, and there's a tour guide that doesn't tell you everything about the place, but he makes you love the place so much that you want to find out everything about the place. You ask your own questions.
Yeah.
And in a way, that was Rabbi Steinsaltz.
Right. So in his, you know, in some ways, I think he was one of the leaders at a time when there was a period where you didn't need an English language introduction to Kabbalah, because if you couldn't access the sources, you weren't interested in Kabbalah. And if you could, you didn't need the introduction. But we do live in a time in which people who aren't versed in Talmud want to learn it. People who don't know Kabbalah are thirsting for it. We're aware of what we're hungry for. And he stepped into that place. What do you think he would have offered? And I'm pivoting to the Talmud because I'm aware that I want to leave time for people's questions too. So sure. I have two topics I want us to get to. Certainly I can see you, his Talmud is behind you on the shelf. And kudos to you if your eyes can still read that tiny print.
Yeah, I use a magnifying glass.
Okay, good. I feel better. You've comforted me, Rabbi. All right. But you know what's extraordinary about it, and I want to highlight and then offer a critique and hear your thought of it. He talks the Talmud, right? So it's like you and he and the Talmud are sitting around a table together, sharing a cup of coffee, and he makes the Talmud reveal itself. He has a conversation in which the Talmud shares with you what it is and why it's doing, so that you, whether you've had background in Talmud or not, you can be part of the conversation, which is amazing. It also looks to me like he didn't pay much attention to the academic study of Talmud, the kinds of things that professors of Talmud at universities or seminaries were producing. So talk to me about what his goal was in producing his remarkable edition of the Talmud.
So I think you hit the nail on the head. He wanted to make it not just accessible to all, but he wanted to make it accessible to all by having the Talmud speak to its to people and speak its own words. It wasn't his words. It wasn't Rabbi Steinsaltz's words on the Talmud, but it was rather his enhancement of the Talmud that made it accessible to all. And I would say this, maybe maybe a different, another anecdote. And I hope you don't mind.
No, please, we're enjoying them. Thank you.
I remember, and I mentioned this for a tribute that we had during his Shiva, but I remember being with him not far from Central Park, and I believe it was a helm tree, that we were walking next to this magnificent tree, and then he tells me, Pini, there are 3 types of people in the world. There are those that walk by a beautiful tree and don't even notice it. There are those that walk by a beautiful tree and say, wow, this is beautiful. That's must be God's creation. And then there are those who say, it's so beautiful, I want this tree in my backyard. And then he plucked a leaf from the tree, put it in his pocket. He said, I'm that type of person, and I want you to be that type of person too.
Wow.
And that's what he did with the Talmud. You can walk by the Talmud and say, oh, this is beautiful. But that wasn't his goal. He wanted you to take the Talmud home. He wanted you to take Rav Ashi and Ravina and make them a part of your dining room table. That's really what he wanted. And I believe that he achieved that more than anyone else.
Wonderful. When people read the Talmud 1,000 years from now, let's hope that they read the Talmud 1,000 years from now, and they line up all the commentaries and all the information, what will they turn to the Steinsaltz for?
What will they turn to the Steinsaltz commentary for?
What specifically will be the role of that commentary as opposed to all the other, there's Art Scroll has a commentary, Rashi has a commentary, there are a whole bunch of Spanish authorities in the medieval period. There's no end of chidushim and commentaries to the Talmud. There's going to be a purpose why someone says, oh, check the Steinsaltz.
Right.
What's that going to be?
So, a great question. So I think, this might be a very bold statement, but I really think that just like we can't fully understand the Tanakh, the Bible, without Rashi, so too we can't fully understand the Talmud without Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz, in a way, comes to better our understanding and of the Talmud and the relevance of the Talmud to us too. So I would say that in 1,000 years from now, when people will be looking at all sorts of commentaries, if you want to know what the Talmud is really about, then Rabbi Steinsaltz will still be as relevant then as it is today, in truly helping us understand the Talmud. To use another analogy, but I don't know if it's an accurate one or not. But look, you can look. If you like cooking, you can have a nice cake, and say this is a nice chocolate cake, and in that cake you have some cream and some cherries and whatever it may be. I think many commentaries speak about the cherries of the cake, the cream of the cake. They even speak maybe about the taste of the cake. Rabbi Steinsaltz is really the only commentary that makes you taste the cake itself. And then you can figure out what it's all about, whether it's a chocolate cake, what type of cherries there are, and so on.
Wonderful.
So
Okay, I'm sure you're not implying opposite, but I also just want to say to his credit that your fellow French Jew, Rashi, I don't think you could understand the Talmud without him either. So just in fairness,
In all fairness, absolutely, yeah. They go hand in hand. When Rabbi Steinsaltz passed, I said, who knows? But I'm sure that the first one to greet him was Rashi.
I would imagine that's the case.
Yeah.
I would imagine that's the case. All right, so last thing before we open up to the Q&A, and I do want to remind people who are joining us that we're happy to look at your questions, and I will selectively share them in the conversation. So if you have questions you want to ask, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. You get extra points for being brief. So Rabbi, you talked about how he wasn't involved in politics, with 2 big exceptions. One was, as you know, he was very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement. And he did that from very early on. So I'd love to hear how that's not politics, and what impelled him to do that. And then I'm going to put the other one out on the table just so we have it out there.
Yeah. So
what you're doing right now is itself, for some, an act of courage. You're on the screen with a heretic. You're talking to a bunch of the unwashed. Not everyone would do that. And I think that also reflects your being his Talmid, that he also embraced every Jew and would reach out. And that was reflected honestly in his writings. You know, the way he portrayed some of the rabbis of the Talmud, the way he portrayed some of the beloved figures in the Bible, he got criticism for because he insisted on treating them like people. Beloved, honored teachers, but people. And he got lambasted by some for that. So talk to me about those two things. The willingness to say, normally I don't do politics, but I'm going to get involved in Soviet Jewry. And while being a staunchly Orthodox Jew himself, I'm going to be an Orthodox Jew for all of Israel, not just for a subset of Israel.
Right. Yeah. So that's a great, two great questions. So to speak a little bit about his involvement in Soviet Jewry. First, he saw that involvement, and I know that he said this to me, as pikuach nefesh. In fact, the parable he used was Rabbi Akiva's parable of the fish that were lured out of the water by a fox one day. And the fish said, no, I mean, no matter what you seduce us with, we can't leave the water, that's our life. And in a way, I think Rabbi Steinsaltz saw that Soviet Jews were coming out of the waters of their own identity, of Judaism, of their own soul. So he saw this really as an act of pikuach nefesh, of saving them. And it wasn't just politics, but it was so much more than that for Rabbi Steinsaltz. And therefore he dedicated himself to that, and in ways that were still mysterious until this very day. And I think that speaks to the second take on this, in his involvement of in Soviet Jewry, especially before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But Rabbi Steinsaltz was never a man that made great noises. He didn't quite believe in demonstrations too much. He was a man who said, if you want to create change, go behind the scenes, do it there. And his involvement in Soviet Jewry wasn't an involvement where he wrote articles about, you know, let my people go and so on and so forth, even though I'm sure he supported those ideas passively. But he was a man who went to meet with those Soviet officials. He risked his life in a way to travel to Russia and meet with governmental officials so that they could help the Jews of their own cities. He believed in those one-on-one silent meetings much more than the big noise that is made by politics and the media often. That's number one. Relating to your second question, look, I'll tell you this. First of all, God forbid, you're a colleague, you're a rabbi just as I am, you're not a heretic or anything like that. But Rabbi Steinsaltz didn't believe in labels. Labels, as he said once, are for meat packing. They're not for human beings. And certainly not for Jews. And I subscribe to that philosophy. I don't believe in Reform Jews, in conservative Jews, in Orthodox Jews, in ultra-Orthodox Jews, and in Reconstructionists. I don't think that these labels are essentially Jewish. Moses, what was he? Was he Orthodox or Reform? Queen Esther, what was she? Those labels didn't exist then. And I think that's because, again, Rabbi Steinsaltz wanted to define people by their souls, not by their bodies. The soul is infinite. The soul has its own unique purpose. And that's how you relate it to people. And going back to what we said at the beginning, his ultimate goal was to infect people so that they move forward in their own unique journey. If you've boxed them, they don't have a unique journey anymore. So,
you know, just to remind our listeners, he actually writes about that explicitly. He takes a Kabbalistic, Jewish mystical belief that everybody comes primarily from one sphera or another, one of God's manifestations. So someone can be primarily a Chesed Jew or a Din Jew or a Netzach Jew. And of course, each of the sphirot contain all of the sphirot. So we're none of us reducible. But to see everyone's uniqueness as a manifestation of God, rather than flattening it out that everyone has to come to it in the same way, I think there's a pedigree for the way he treated other Jews in the mysticism that he taught.
Right.
So we have a bunch of questions here. There's no way I'm going to be able to get to all of them, but let's try to talk about some of them if we can. So at a Seder, he talked about how you have to go across the river to bring someone to the Seder and get him to taste the maror. Did he use that approach in other teachings and other concepts as well?
That particular example of making someone taste the maror. I don't know if in that particular example, but again, I think it's reflective, right, of the approach that we spoke about, that he wanted people to taste themselves what it was to come out of Egypt and what it felt like, the bitter experience of being a slave in Egypt. He wanted to bring you to that moment in history so that you can relive it. So it's certainly reflective of that.
Beautiful. And look, I also think there's a way, I wasn't there for the teaching, but I do think there's something important in saying, if your Judaism doesn't have any maror in it, any of the bitterness, then it's not really Judaism, in the same way that if your marriage is only sweetness and light and nothing else, you know, it's not really a marriage until you've disagreed and figured out how to live with each other while disagreeing in a way that is constructive and caring.
Absolutely right. Right. You know, one of the great teachings I heard from him was that the word for crisis in Hebrew is the same word as the word for that bed on which pregnant women give birth, mashber. And that's because in every crisis, there's an opportunity waiting to be born.
That's beautiful.
Right.
Beautiful. Two people have asked about his relationship to the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
So he was a devout disciple of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, no doubt. He, in fact, on his tombstone, the word rabbi is not mentioned. It's reflecting his humility, but it does speak about how he was kashur balev vanefesh. He was connected with his whole heart and soul to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They had a very unique relationship, unique in the sense of it was almost like you know, two brothers getting together, maybe an older brother and a younger brother getting together, and each time they met, we actually saw that brotherly love. We saw the tremendous respect they had for one another. They spent hours and hours with each other alone. Rabbi Steinsaltz would have many private audiences with the Rebbe in which they spoke about every topic, and he was in the room with the Rebbe for many hours each time. The Rebbe would even, Rabbi Steinsaltz himself told me that the Rebbe would ask Rabbi Steinsaltz for his opinion on all sorts of matters, including his own personal matters. Rabbi Steinsaltz told me himself that once the Rebbe had just published a discourse of his, and he gave it to Rabbi Steinsaltz, and he said to him, yeah, read it, tell me what you think about it, and if there's any corrections to be made.
Wow.
So they had that very intimate relationship that was filled with love and mutual respect.
That's beautiful. Somebody comments that not every word of Rashi is from Rashi.
Right.
Boy, poor Rashi is just having a brutal time today. There was a school of Rashi. Is there a school of Steinsaltz? Was every word his, or did he have other people who were working under his supervision?
So at the very beginning, it was entirely him. Eventually, he built himself a team. And eventually, he also stopped writing himself, but rather recorded his books. And they would transcribe those words, edit them. He would go over the final edits and then give his okay to publish them. So in that sense, you're right. Many of his writings were not necessarily his writings, were not his words, but they were certainly words that he approved.
And in the Talmud, the later editions of Talmud, were there other people helping to write drafts, fill it in, help?
Yeah. Yes. There was a strong team of, you know, those people need to be recognized. Rabbi Meir Negbi, Yonatan Eliyav, Gershon Kitzis, and some others who really devoted their days and nights to writing the Talmud together with Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz would, you know, for the first decade, I believe, and even more so, he did everything by himself. So it was pretty clear what he wanted. He set the structure. He would go over every Talmudic page, and with that team, then produce the final product.
That's great. We have someone who asked, how was his commentary, how were his writings influenced by his expertise in science?
I think they were influenced by not just his expertise in science, but his expertise also in zoology and in meteorology and every topic that he loved to study. They were influenced by his breadth of his almost infinite breadth of knowledge. So when he wrote from a standpoint of knowledge, of depth, And that's how they were, in a way, very influenced. But I think that the common denominator between all of these different topics, whether it's science or not, is that, as Rabbi Steinsaltz told me once, I see God everywhere. And he looked for that God in science, and he looked for that God in a peacock, and he looked for that God in an architectural wall.
Yeah.
So that God that he found everywhere certainly influenced his writing.
Great. Is there a biography about him in English?
Okay.
Question.
It's on the web. A series biography about him. Check it out.
There's a biography. I mean, I think by his own Steinsaltz.org, if I'm not mistaken. That's the institution that represents him. But I'm sure you can find it, even on Wikipedia.
So let me point out to those of you who are interested, the Wikipedia article is actually excellent and has lots and lots of articles linked to it. So you can follow up on different aspects of his work and his writing. So I want to ask one more question, and then I want to ask you, Rabbi, a personal question.
Sure.
So did he write about other issues of Jewish law?
Yes, he wrote articles about certain Jewish laws, particularly the law that comes to mind is actually the law of modernized items, technological items for Shabbat, those that are okay to use on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an article that comes to mind to answer that question. And I will say this, that last year, or maybe 2 years ago, he had 4 volumes that came out called Yahadut Bejeans, Judaism in Jeans, again, representing his obsession to infect everyone and to bring Judaism even to the jeans.
Nice.
But one of those volumes is Shara HaHalacha, which is the gate of halacha, of Jewish law. And there he really goes over so many different Jewish laws that pertain to our day-to-day life. These volumes were written also by a team of people, but again, he spearheaded the project and edited it.
Very nice. You know, Maimonides, we've mentioned before, writes a letter to a rabbi who wants to come visit him, and he lays out what his day looks like. What did a Steinsaltz day look like? You've indicated that he didn't need as much sleep as the rest of us. That's a big advantage. So word to those of you who are thinking about being rabbis, try to get over your need for sleep.
Right.
What was his day like?
So you're right, he didn't sleep. He used that famous Jewish axiom that sleep is for the grave. And he would elaborate on that. He would say, well, God allocated time for everything in life. So if I sleep during my lifetime, what will I do in the grave? I'm sure he's not sleeping in his grave right now also. He's still,
no. There's a new machon up in heaven.
Right. But look, I don't know exactly what he would do. I know that his day would begin at 8 a.m. Well, he would pray before that day began. So it probably began at 6:30 or 7. At 8 a.m., he would then go to his office, work there and meet people there, counsel people and so on until about 3 p.m. Then he would go home, take a little siesta, a little nap, a half an hour nap, maybe do some exercise. I think he would walk around his block, like the Rashba, for example, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet of Barcelona of the 13th century. So he would walk to maintain his health. Then he would go back to his office at about 5:30 until 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
And that's, of course, when he was in Jerusalem. Otherwise, there were so many times he would lecture across the world and yes, work with Soviet Jewry and so on.
So I'm going to give you my wife's phone number, and you can call her and tell her that's what a rabbi's day is supposed to look like, because at the moment I don't have authorization for anything close to that.
The one condition that I give you my wife's number and you tell her the same.
Your wife has already performed service above and beyond. She can do whatever she wants. Listen to her. So my last question for you, Rabbi Alush.
Yeah.
On a day-to-day basis, how do you walk with your Rebbe? How does he manifest in who you are, in what you do, in what you aim for?
That's a great question. Well, he's with me all the time. And it's funny because I sense him more after his passing than even before his passing. But to answer that question, I'll use a Rashi since, you know, I have to make up for not mentioning. Let me quote a Rashi, that famous Rashi that speaks about how Joseph resisted seduction by the wife of Potiphar. He was a lonely teenager in Egypt, abandoned by his family. And there you have a beautiful woman trying to seduce him, and he withstands that test. What happened? And Rashi points out that it was diukano shel aviv nira'ah elav, that it was the image of his father that appeared to him at that moment, and he said, no, my father has inspired me not to fall into this trap. And in a way, I think that that's the way Rabbi Steinsaltz continues to be with me. His image appears not just in moments of seductions, not that I have, you know, those Joseph moments, but other moments in which I might fall into a little depression. I might fall into a little challenge. And then he appears to me. And then sometimes he appears to me also in moments of meetings with people. What would Rabbi Steinsaltz say? Or in moments of sermons, and in other moments in which I'm engaged in my rabbinic work. And sometimes it appears to me when I'm lying in bed and Rabbi Steinsaltz is there hovering upon me and saying, what are you doing here? Go work, do something, stop.
Yes. I'll close with you know, in some ways, your Rebbe has now become one of the Rebbes to the world. And his influence will now spread through his writings and through his Talmidim, his students. My Rebbe was Rabbi Simon Greenberg, remarkable scholar, man of incredible integrity. And I often find myself literally sitting with him. He died in Yerushalayim with a midrash open, and he just kind of lay into the midrash. And every Shabbos when I learn midrash, I'm sitting with my Rebbe. So I bless you that you and your Rebbe should have many, many times of sitting together in great joy and great communion and in great spirit. I want to let everybody know that this is recorded and it will be made available. No, it won't? Deb?
We're working on that right now.
We're working on it. It's supposed to be being recorded, but you know, man plans and God laughs. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Deb. And I want to thank Rabbi Alush for being a mensch and a tzaddik himself, and for giving of himself today to us and our community. And on a personal note, Pinchas, I look forward to the opportunity of many more conversations with you together in the future.
Amen, amen. Thank you, Rabbi Artson. It was really a pleasure, and not just conversing with you, but connecting my soul to yours. And I look forward to burgeoning friendship, growing from strength to strength.
Amen. And Shana Tova to you and your family.
Amen. Amen. Exactly. Shana Tova to each and all. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Alush, Rabbi Artson. What an inspiring conversation. And I know that I feel connected in a way now to Rabbi Steinsaltz in a way that I didn't before. And I can't begin to thank you for your warmth and your sharing. And just this has been a beautiful morning for me here in Los Angeles. And I'm sure for all our participants, we have just been inspired. And it's our job now, as you pointed out from what Rabbi Steinsaltz wanted, to connect in our own ways to God. And I feel more inspired now for Rosh Hashanah and to find my own connections. So thank you so much for that. On behalf of American Jewish University, I want to thank everyone for being with us today on this platform, B'Yachad Together. I invite you all to come and join us again and again for more dialogue, conversations, debates. Please see our website, which is in the chat function for you to all see, to join us again and again. Thank you so much, everybody. Be safe. Shana Tova, Shabbat Shalom. And we look forward to being with you again. Bye-bye.